Shrouded in mist and surrounded by restless seas, the island stood as both fortress and frontier. For centuries, the waves carried not only merchants and pilgrims, but also raiders and conquerors, each leaving their mark upon its shores. In the 9th century, the land was fractured, divided among rival kingdoms, each struggling for survival against one another and against the relentless tide of Viking invasion. At times, it seemed the island's destiny was to be consumed by stronger powers, erased from history before its story had truly begun. Yet from this uncertainty emerged resilience. A vision of unity began to take shape under Alfred the Great, the king who defended his people against the Vikings and laid the foundations of a realm that could endure. His legacy was not merely survival, but the idea of England itself, fragile at first, yet destined to grow into something greater. Centuries later, another turning point arrived. William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the sea in 1066 and won a kingdom with a single decisive battle. From his rule flowed changes that transformed the island forever: a new aristocracy, a new language, and a new order of governance. The Norman kings imposed strength, but in time, their successors were forced to share power, confronted by nobles who compelled King John to accept the Magna Carta in 1215, a charter that would echo across ages as the first step in limiting monarchy through law. As the Middle Ages gave way to the tumult of the 16th century, the story of England entered another age of upheaval. Henry VIII severed ties with Rome, declaring the monarch head of the Church of England. His defiance reshaped faith and politics, binding the destiny of the crown to the destiny of the nation. From this act flowed centuries of conflict and reform, but also the emergence of a distinctly English path. Elizabeth I inherited a fragile realm, yet carried it into glory. She stood against the might of Spain, presided over voyages that reached distant shores, and nurtured a culture whose words and music still resonate today. Under her reign, the kingdom discovered its voice as a power on the world stage. The centuries that followed brought new challenges. Civil wars tore at the fabric of the nation, kings were overthrown, and parliaments claimed their place in governance. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain had become the center of an empire so vast it spanned continents. Under Queen Victoria, the empire reached its zenith, a symbol of both industrial progress and imperial ambition, admired and resented in equal measure. In the modern era, another Elizabeth ascended the throne. Elizabeth II reigned not over conquest, but over continuity. Through war, decolonization, and profound social change, she remained a figure of stability, a living connection between a 1,000-year tradition and a rapidly shifting world. The story of England is not a simple one. It is filled with conquest and resistance, triumph and crisis, continuity and transformation. It is a tale of rulers and parliaments, of ordinary men and women who endured plague, war, and revolution, and of a nation that, time and again, stood on the brink of defeat, only to rise anew. The question lingers through every chapter. How did this island, once divided and vulnerable, become a force that shaped the destiny of the world? Was it the vision of its kings and queens, the adaptability of its institutions, or the endurance of its people? Perhaps it was the interplay of all three, woven together into a story of survival and reinvention. From Alfred to Elizabeth, from wooden halls lit by fire to palaces of stone, from Viking raids to global wars, the 1,000-year journey of England reveals not only the fate of a kingdom, but the forging of an identity. This is the chronicle of how a nation rose from peril to power, and how its legacy still echoes across the centuries. Before Alfred could defend a kingdom, there had to be one to defend. And in the 9th century, England was still only a dream. In the 9th century, the island was far from the unified realm it would one day become. Instead, it was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each with its own traditions, rulers, and ambitions. This arrangement was known as the Heptarchy. Wessex in the south, Mercia in the Midlands, Northumbria stretching across the north, alongside smaller realms like East Anglia, Kent, Essex, and Sussex. Each kingdom claimed its own pride of place, and though alliances were sometimes forged, rivalry was constant. The dream of a united England was still only a distant vision, fragile and undefined. Among these kingdoms, Mercia once held supremacy, ruling over its neighbors with power and influence. Yet by the dawn of the 9th century, its dominance had waned. Northumbria, once a center of learning and monastic culture, was weakened by internal disputes and border conflicts. Wessex, situated in the south, was growing in strength, but it remained vulnerable, its survival dependent on the stability of its rulers and the resilience of its people. Into this fragile landscape came a new and terrifying force from across the sea. The Vikings, who had first appeared as raiders striking monasteries and coastal villages, now came in far greater numbers and with far greater ambition. Their long ships cut through rivers and estuaries, penetrating deep inland. No longer content with plunder alone, they sought to conquer and settle. In 865, what chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army landed on English shores. This was not a fleeting raid, but a campaign of conquest, composed of warriors from across Denmark and Norway, bound together by the promise of land and spoils. They swept through East Anglia, captured York in Northumbria, and pressed further into the heart of the land. For the first time, the kingdoms of England faced not merely raiding parties, but the threat of permanent loss, of entire regions falling under foreign rule. The Anglo-Saxon kings were unprepared for the scale of this onslaught. Battles were fought and lost, treaties made and broken. One kingdom after another fell under Viking control or influence. East Anglia was overrun, its king slain. Northumbria fractured, its old glory extinguished. Even Mercia, once the mightiest, was humbled and forced to yield land. Yet the tide was not uniform. Amid the chaos, one realm began to emerge as the center of resistance: Wessex. Its rulers, though harried and outnumbered, understood that survival required more than courage. It demanded strategy, reform, and unity. The story of how Wessex endured against the great heathen army would set the stage for what followed. For in the crucible of the Viking Wars, the idea of an English nation began to take form. This was the world Alfred would inherit, a land fractured and besieged, where the survival of Wessex meant the survival of England itself. From the ashes of defeat, he would attempt to craft a new vision, one that would endure long after the Viking sails vanished from the horizon. From the chaos of invasion emerged the figure who would reshape England's fate: Alfred. Alfred came to the throne of Wessex in the year 871, at a moment when the kingdom's survival seemed almost impossible. The great heathen army had swept across the land, and the other Anglo-Saxon realms had either fallen or been forced into uneasy submission. Wessex stood as the last line of defense, and Alfred, still a young man, carried on his shoulders the fate of all that remained of independent England. The early years of his reign were marked by retreat and uncertainty. Viking forces pressed deeper, seizing towns and strongholds, forcing Alfred to fight a war of endurance rather than conquest. At times, it appeared the kingdom might vanish altogether, broken apart as so many others had been. Yet Alfred possessed not only determination, but also the ability to learn, to adapt, and to transform weakness into strategy. He reorganized his defenses, gathering intelligence on the movements of his enemies and keeping his realm alive even when hope seemed dim. In 878, the crisis reached its height. The Vikings launched a sudden assault in the winter, seizing Chippenham and driving Alfred into the marshes of Somerset. What might have been the end of Wessex instead became the moment of its renewal. From the wetlands, Alfred rallied his followers, building a resistance that struck back against the invaders. That spring, he gathered an army and confronted the Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington. Against odds that once would have seemed insurmountable, Alfred's forces prevailed. The victory at Edington was more than a battlefield triumph. It was the turning point of a nation. In its aftermath, Guthrum agreed to terms, accepting baptism and a division of territory. The treaty marked the establishment of what later generations would call the Danelaw, where Viking settlers held sway in the east and north, while Wessex retained the south and west. England remained divided, but it was no longer on the verge of annihilation. Alfred had preserved a kingdom, and with it, the possibility of a future. Yet Alfred knew that survival required more than winning a single battle. He set about reshaping his realm to withstand further attacks. He reorganized the Fyrd, the part-time militia of free men, into a more flexible system of service, ensuring that an army could always be fielded while daily life continued. He constructed a chain of fortified towns known as burhs, placed strategically across Wessex. These strongholds became centers of defense, trade, and administration, anchoring the kingdom with both security and stability. Alfred's vision extended beyond warfare. He recognized that a kingdom built only on arms could not endure without the strength of law, learning, and faith. He gathered legal codes, refining and harmonizing them, laying the groundwork for a tradition of justice that would shape English governance for centuries. He believed deeply in the power of knowledge, lamenting the decline of learning that had accompanied years of war. Determined to reverse it, he invited scholars from across Britain and the continent to his court, translated key works into the English tongue, and encouraged education for clergy and nobles alike. Through these efforts, Alfred forged a kingdom that was stronger than the one he had inherited. He gave his people not only protection, but also a renewed sense of identity and purpose. He showed that even in the face of overwhelming danger, leadership rooted in resilience and wisdom could alter the course of history. When Alfred died in 899, he left behind more than a defended Wessex. He left the foundations of a unified England, a vision that his descendants would continue to pursue. Later generations remembered him not simply as a king who fought the Vikings, but as the ruler who first imagined an English nation and who provided the laws, learning, and fortresses to make that vision real. His death in 899 closed a chapter, but it opened a vision that would echo through centuries. When Alfred's life drew to its close in 899, he left behind more than a kingdom preserved. He left a vision that would echo through centuries. His people remembered him not simply as a warrior who defended Wessex, but as a ruler who shaped the very idea of what England could become. Later chroniclers would call him the Father of the English, a title earned not only by his victories, but by the foundations he laid in law, faith, and learning. Before Alfred, the island had been a mosaic of competing powers, each bound to its own local identity. Loyalty was given to Mercia or Northumbria, to Kent or East Anglia, not to a greater whole. Through his reign, however, the sense of a shared destiny began to take form. In the struggle against the Vikings, men from across the southern shires fought together under one banner. In the laws he codified and the books he had translated, Alfred envisioned a culture bound not only by survival, but by a common language and tradition. Out of hardship arose the first fragile outlines of a kingdom of the English. His successors inherited more than his throne. They inherited a model of kingship that blended strength with duty, authority with responsibility. Alfred demonstrated that a king was not merely a commander of armies, but also a guardian of justice and a patron of wisdom. By insisting on the importance of learning, he planted seeds that would grow into a society where the written word, the law, and the church all played roles in binding people together. The memory of Alfred endured in chronicles and in legend, but more importantly, in the institutions that traced their origins to his rule. The burhs he built became the nuclei of towns. The laws he issued shaped the evolving sense of order. The identity he fostered, of a people bound not just by geography, but by common purpose, would guide England through the centuries of division and conquest that still lay ahead. Alfred did not live to see England unified, yet he made that unification possible. His reign transformed Wessex from a last refuge into the core of a future nation. From the marshes of Somerset to the halls of Winchester, he left a legacy of resilience and vision. In the centuries to come, kings and chroniclers would look back to him as the one who first gave meaning to the name of England, and who proved that from the edge of despair, a kingdom could be reborn. What Alfred envisioned, it fell to his heirs to realize. When Alfred's descendants carried his vision forward, it was his grandson Aethelstan who would transform that vision into reality. In 924, Aethelstan inherited the throne of a kingdom already stronger than in Alfred's time, yet still fragile, still contested by rival lords and threatened by enemies beyond its borders. From the moment of his coronation, he sought not merely to defend Wessex, but to bring the disparate peoples of the island into one realm. Aethelstan's reign was marked by ambition and determination. He extended his influence over Mercia, secured alliances in the north, and asserted authority in regions where loyalty had long been divided. Step by step, he tightened the bonds between once separate kingdoms, shaping them into something greater than the sum of their parts. He was the first king to be acknowledged not only as ruler of Wessex or Mercia, but as sovereign over all the English. Chroniclers would later describe him with a title that carried new weight: Rex Totius Britanniae, King of the whole of Britain. This claim was not without challenge. In 937, a great coalition of his enemies sought to test his strength. Vikings from Dublin allied with the kings of Scotland and Strathclyde, bringing together an army meant to crush Aethelstan's rule and unravel the unity he had forged. The confrontation came at Brunanburh, a battle that would become legendary in English memory. There, Aethelstan and his half-brother Edmund led their forces against the alliance. The fighting was fierce, the outcome uncertain, but in the end, Aethelstan's leadership and the resilience of his army prevailed. The victory at Brunanburh secured his legacy as the first true overlord of all England, a moment the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle celebrated in verse as the triumph that preserved the land from dissolution. In the years that followed, Aethelstan ruled with an authority no English king had wielded before. He issued laws that sought to bind his kingdom together, setting standards of justice that echoed Alfred's reforms but carried them further. He promoted the use of coinage and trade across his domains, encouraging economic ties between once fragmented regions. His court became a center of learning and diplomacy, drawing scholars from across Europe and sending gifts and correspondence to kings and emperors on the continent. For the first time, the idea of an English nation was no longer just a hope or a possibility. It was embodied in a living monarch. Under Aethelstan, local loyalties began to merge into a wider identity, one that recognized a common ruler and a common destiny. Though later centuries would bring new invasions, new rivalries, and new struggles, the unity he achieved endured as a model, a precedent to which later rulers would look. When Aethelstan died in 939, he left behind a realm more firmly united than ever before. His reign marked the moment when the dream of Alfred matured into the substance of history. He was remembered not only as a warrior king who won at Brunanburh, but as the monarch who first bound the English into a single people, giving shape to the nation that would carry forward through all the triumphs and trials to come. Aethelstan's triumph secured a nation, yet his heirs would struggle to keep it whole. After Aethelstan's death in 939, the unity he had forged proved difficult to maintain. His successors inherited a realm larger than any Anglo-Saxon king had ruled before, but the bonds between its regions were still new, still fragile. There followed years of uncertainty, as kings rose and fell, each struggling to hold together the vision of one England. Yet amid this turbulence, there were moments of strength that revealed how deeply Aethelstan's legacy had taken root. In the later decades of the 10th century, the crown passed to Edgar, remembered by history as Edgar the Peaceful. His reign, stretching from 959 to 975, marked a rare interval of stability. Under Edgar, the kingdom was not defined by constant warfare, but by order and consolidation. He worked closely with the church, strengthening monastic life and promoting reform. His authority was recognized across the land, and he was even ceremonially rowed on the River Dee by subordinate kings as a sign of his overlordship. For a generation, England seemed secure, bound by a balance of power and faith. But peace did not last. After Edgar's death, divisions resurfaced, and by the time Ethelred came to the throne in 978, the kingdom faced fresh danger from the north. Known by posterity as Ethelred the Unready, his reign was plagued by indecision and ill fortune. The Viking threat, which had subsided for a time, returned with force. Fleets crossed the sea, raiding and seizing wealth from coastal towns, reminding the English that the age of invasion was not yet over. Ethelred's response revealed the weaknesses of his rule. Instead of consistent resistance, he often chose to pay his enemies to leave in peace. These payments, known as Danegeld, drained the treasury, but offered little lasting security. Again and again, vast sums of silver were handed over, only for the raiders to return with greater demands. Each payment bought a fragile truce, But it also signaled to the Vikings that England could be exploited. The people suffered not only from raids, but from a sense that their king lacked the resolve to defend them. Chronicles describe frustration and despair, for though the resources of the realm were great, leadership faltered. Ethelred's reign became a cautionary tale of how indecision at the top could weaken even a strong kingdom. Yet even in these years of weakness, the idea of a united England did not collapse. The structures built by Alfred and aethelstan remained, and though tested, they endured. The crown still held authority across the land, and the English still thought of themselves as one people. The storm that gathered in Ethelred's time would bring further upheaval, but it would also prepare the stage for the next great contest over who would rule England and define its future. And from England's fragility came conquest, reshaping the kingdom under foreign rule. The weakness of Ethelred's reign left England exposed, and from that vulnerability emerged a new ruler who would reshape the kingdom. In 1016, after years of raids and shifting alliances, Snut, the son of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, secured the English throne. His victory brought not only conquest, but the creation of a northern empire. For nearly 2 decades, Canute ruled over England, Denmark, and Norway, commanding lands that stretched across the North Sea and binding them together under a single crown. Cnut's reign was remarkable not merely for its reach, but for its balance. Though he had won England by force, he did not seek to erase the traditions of the Anglo-Saxons. Instead, he pursued a policy of accommodation, blending the customs of Viking settlers with the laws and institutions of the land he now governed. He confirmed the rights of the church, upheld many of the legal codes that had developed under Alfred and his heirs, and sought to present himself as a Christian king in the European mold rather than a foreign invader. This policy of compromise allowed him to stabilize a kingdom weary of war. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, linking himself to the old royal line. He maintained the burghs and the legal systems already in place, reassuring his new subjects that their way of life would not be overturned. At the same time, he rewarded his Danish followers with lands and titles, creating a new aristocracy that was loyal to him. By uniting these elements, he achieved a rare peace, and under his rule, England became not a battleground, but a strong and prosperous part of a wider northern empire. Snut's vision was ambitious. He corresponded with the papacy, made pilgrimages, and sought recognition as a ruler whose authority stood alongside the great monarchs of Europe. In his reign, England was not isolated, but part of a larger network of power stretching across Scandinavia and the continent. The balance he struck between conqueror and king gave his rule an authority that few could challenge. Yet the unity he forged depended heavily on his personal strength. When Cnut died in 1035, the empire he built began to unravel. His sons Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut struggled for dominance, and rival factions within England's court split their loyalties. The balance between Anglo-Saxon and Danish interests frayed, and the stability of Cnut's years gave way once more to uncertainty. Within a generation, the line of Danish kings was broken, and the throne would return to the heirs of the old Anglo-Saxon dynasty. Still, the memory of Cnut's reign lingered. He had shown that England could be part of a wider world, tied not only to the island, but to the shifting currents of European power. His time as king left behind both order and lessons, a chapter in which foreign conquest briefly gave rise to stability before the tide of succession swept it away. The fall of the Danish line opened the way for the restoration of the Anglo-Saxon kings. When the line of Danish kings came to an end, the English throne returned to the heirs of its older dynasty. In 1042, Edward, later known as Edward the Confessor, was crowned king. His ascension marked the restoration of the Anglo-Saxon royal house, a moment of continuity that many hoped would bring stability after decades of turbulence. Edward himself had spent much of his youth in exile in Normandy, and he returned to England with a character shaped by both Anglo-Saxon tradition and continental influence. Edward's reign was distinctive for its piety and devotion. Chroniclers remembered him as a man of quiet nature, deeply committed to the church and inclined toward peace rather than war. Under his patronage, one of the most enduring symbols of medieval England was constructed, Westminster Abbey. Rising in stone on the banks of the Thames, the abbey not only served as a center of worship, but also as a statement of royal authority and spiritual legitimacy. It was in this place that future kings and queens would be crowned, binding Edward's legacy to the heart of English monarchy for centuries to come. Yet Edward's reign was not without tension. His long years in Normandy had created ties to that duchy, and his court in England reflected this influence. Norman advisors and clerics gained prominence, unsettling the Anglo-Saxon nobility. The great earls of the realm, especially the powerful Godwin family of Wessex, often stood in uneasy balance with the king's favor toward his Norman allies. These rivalries shaped the politics of the kingdom, giving rise to factions that would later play decisive roles in the struggle for succession. Above all, the greatest shadow over Edward's rule was his failure to produce an heir. Married to Edith, daughter of Earl Godwin, Edward remained childless, and as the years passed, the question of succession became more pressing. Different claimants began to emerge. Harold Godwinson, Edith's brother and the leading Earl of England; William, Duke of Normandy, who would later assert that Edward had promised him the throne; and even foreign rulers such as Harold Hardrada of Norway, who looked upon England as a prize worth seizing. Edward himself seems to have left the matter unresolved. Some accounts suggest he named Harold as his successor on his deathbed, others that he had earlier given his word to William. Whatever the truth, his failure to establish a clear line of succession left England vulnerable to dispute. When Edward died in January 1066, he was laid to rest in the very abbey he had built, Westminster. His death closed the chapter of the restored Anglo-Saxon dynasty and opened one of the most dramatic crises in English history. Within months, rival claimants would march with their armies, and the fate of the kingdom would hang on the outcome of battles that would decide not only who would be king, but the very future of England itself. But with his death, the question Edward left unanswered would plunge the realm into crisis. When Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, he left behind no heir, only uncertainty. In that vacuum of succession, three claimants rose, each with a case for the throne, and each prepared to defend it with arms. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex and the most powerful noble in England, had been named king by the English Council of Lords, the Witan. His rise seemed the natural choice, a continuation of the Anglo-Saxon tradition, and he was crowned in Westminster Abbey within days of Edward's burial. Yet across the seas, rivals stirred, convinced the crown was theirs by right. William, Duke of Normandy, argued that Edward had promised him the throne during his exile, and that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support that claim. To William, Harold's coronation was nothing less than betrayal. Further north, Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, invoked older agreements between his predecessors and the Danish kings of England. He believed England was his to conquer, and with him stood Tostig, Harold Godwinson's exiled brother, eager for revenge against his own kin. In late September 1066, the first storm broke. Hardrada sailed from Norway with a great fleet and landed in the north. Harold Godwinson, newly crowned, marched his army from the south at extraordinary speed to meet the invasion. On the 25th of September, the two forces clashed at Stamford Bridge near York. The battle was fierce and decisive. Harold's men, fighting on home soil and driven by urgency, shattered Hardrada's army. Both Hardrada and Tostig fell in the fighting, and the Norwegian fleet that had come so proudly across the sea limped home with only a fraction of its men. England seemed secure, its king triumphant, but triumph was fleeting. Even as Harold celebrated victory in the north, William of Normandy had already crossed the Channel and landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast. Harold now faced a second invasion, one perhaps more dangerous than the first. Exhausted from their march and battle, his army was forced to turn south in haste. Within 3 weeks of Stamford Bridge, Harold stood once more at the head of his troops, this time facing William's disciplined Norman host. On the 14th of October, 1066, the two armies met at Hastings. The English, relying on their shield wall of infantry, took position on a ridge, while the Normans, with cavalry and archers, pressed from below. The struggle lasted from morning to dusk, a contest of endurance as much as arms. Again and again, the Norman charges broke upon the English defenses, and again William rallied his men, turning feigned retreats into sudden counterattacks. Late in the day, As fatigue spread and formations loosened, Harold himself was struck down. The collapse of his leadership unraveled the line, and the Normans surged forward. When the sun set, the Anglo-Saxon age had ended. William stood victorious on the field, his claim secured not by promise or oath, but by conquest. Within months, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the very church Edward had built, symbolizing both continuity and change. With his coronation, the Anglo-Saxon line was broken, and a new chapter began. The Norman dynasty, which would bind England more closely to continental Europe and reshape its language, culture, and society forever. The year 1066 thus became a turning point unmatched in English history, a moment when the fate of a kingdom was decided not by peaceful succession, but by the clash of rival claims and the outcome of battles. From that year forward, England would never be the same. The conquest was only the beginning. What followed was the remaking of England itself. William's coronation in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066, was more than a ceremony. It was the declaration of a new order. The Anglo-Saxon age had ended, and in its place, William of Normandy began to construct a kingdom reshaped in the image of his rule. He had won England by the sword, but he intended to hold it through structures far more enduring than a battlefield victory. At the heart of his power was the imposition of Norman feudalism. The land once held by Anglo-Saxon nobles was redistributed to William's Norman followers, binding them to him with loyalty and obligation. In return for their estates, they owed him service, military and political, creating a web of control that reached into every shire and village. For those who resisted, dispossession was swift. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was replaced almost entirely within a generation, and the new Norman lords, bound by feudal ties, ensured William's dominance. The transformation was visible not only in politics, but also in stone. To secure his rule, William ordered the construction of castles across the land, fortresses of stone that proclaimed both strength and permanence. The most enduring of these was the Tower of London, rising along the Thames as a symbol of Norman authority. It was not only a defensive stronghold, but also a message to the conquered people. The new rulers were here to stay. Across England, Maida and Bailey castles became a familiar sight, each a reminder of William's reach. Yet William's rule was not only about conquest and fortification, it was also about administration. In 1086, he ordered a great survey of his realm, an accounting so thorough that it astonished his contemporaries. The result was the Domesday Book, a record of lands, wealth, and obligations across the kingdom. Every manor, field, and herd of livestock was noted, creating a snapshot of England at the close of the 11th century. For William, it was a tool of governance, ensuring that no resource escaped his grasp and no subject was beyond his knowledge. For history, it became one of the most remarkable documents of the medieval world, a testament to the scale and ambition of Norman rule. William's reign was marked by harsh discipline, but also by an unshakable determination to root his dynasty firmly in English soil. By the time of his death in 1087, the structures he had built, feudal obligations, castles of stone, and meticulous records had ensured that Norman rule was unchallenged. He had remade England, tying it to the continent while stamping it with a new identity. The conqueror's legacy was not simply victory at Hastings, but the creation of a kingdom transformed, one whose foundations would shape English history for centuries. From the sword and the survey flowed deeper changes, altering the very fabric of England. The conquest of 1066 did not simply change the crown, it transformed the very fabric of English society. With William's redistribution of lands, the old Anglo-Saxon nobility was almost entirely displaced, replaced by Norman lords whose roots lay across the Channel. Within a single generation, the men who governed England spoke a different tongue, traced their loyalties to Normandy, and brought with them customs that reshaped the culture of the realm. The most profound change came in language. The Normans spoke French, a dialect infused with Latin influence, and it became the speech of the court, the aristocracy, and the law. Anglo-Saxon English, once the language of kings and nobles, was pushed downward, preserved in the villages and among the common people. For centuries, two languages coexisted uneasily. French in the halls of power, English in the fields and markets. Over time, the two merged, creating a richer vocabulary and a new form of English that carried the legacy of both conquerors and conquered. This linguistic divide mirrored the social one. The Norman lords who took control of the land formed a new ruling class. Their estates, granted by William in exchange for loyalty, gave them immense power over the countryside. They built their castles not only as fortresses, but as symbols of authority, towering over towns and villages. The Anglo-Saxon elite, stripped of lands and titles, faded from political life, and in their place rose a nobility whose culture, alliances, and ambitions were tied to continental Europe. England was no longer an isolated island realm, but part of a broader Norman world that stretched across the Channel. The transformation was also visible in religion and architecture. The Normans brought with them a passion for monumental building, particularly in stone. Churches and cathedrals began to rise in the Romanesque style, with massive pillars, rounded arches, and soaring towers. These structures reflected both the power of the church and the authority of the new rulers, standing as visible reminders of the order they sought to impose. Monastic reform, closely tied to the continent, spread through the land, drawing England more firmly into the spiritual and cultural currents of Europe. The conquest thus remade England not only in its governance but in its identity. Language, nobility, and architecture all bore the mark of Norman influence. Though at first these changes deepened divisions between ruler and ruled, over time they created a new synthesis. Out of the meeting of Norman French and Anglo-Saxon tradition, a distinct English culture began to emerge, one that would endure long after the memory of Hastings had passed into legend. But even as Norman rule reshaped society, the question of succession would soon plunge the realm into turmoil. When William the Conqueror died in 1087, his legacy passed not as a single stable inheritance, but as a divided dominion. His eldest son Robert received Normandy, while his second son William Rufus became King of England. Known for his fiery temperament, William II quickly earned a reputation for both energy and conflict. His reign was marked by continual tension with the church, particularly with Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury. Where the church sought independence and reform, William demanded obedience and revenue, often treating ecclesiastical lands as sources of royal wealth. Though his rule strengthened the crown's authority, his sudden death in a hunting accident in 1100 left the throne contested once more. It was William's younger brother Henry who seized the moment. Crowned as Henry I, he sought to legitimize his rule by offering a vision of fair governance. Early in his reign, he issued the Charter of Liberties, a document promising to limit royal abuses and respect the rights of the church and nobles. While not yet the Magna Carta of a later age, it set an important precedent, signaling that kingship was bound by certain expectations of justice. Henry also proved a capable administrator. He reformed the royal treasury, introducing the exchequer system to oversee finances, and expanded the use of written records to strengthen royal control. His marriage to Edith of Scotland, who took the Norman name Matilda, further tied the dynasty to the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, uniting the legacy of conqueror and conquered. Yet Henry's reign, which brought order and reform, ended with a crisis of succession. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, leaving the kingdom without a clear male heir. To secure continuity, Henry declared his daughter, Empress Matilda, as his successor and demanded his barons swear loyalty to her. But when Henry died in 1135, many nobles hesitated to accept a woman as ruler. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, moved quickly to seize the throne, claiming it with the support of a faction of nobles and the church. What followed was nearly 2 decades of civil war, a period remembered as the Anarchy. England descended into chaos as rival lords shifted allegiance between Stephen and Matilda. Castles sprang up across the countryside, warfare devastated towns and villages, and chroniclers lamented that Christ and his saints slept during these troubled years. Neither side could fully prevail, and the kingdom endured prolonged instability. The conflict eventually gave way to compromise. In 1153, it was agreed that Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but that Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, would succeed him. With this settlement, the long years of disorder began to close, and the stage was set for the rise of a new dynasty, the Plantagenets, who would carry England into its next great chapter. From the ashes of anarchy rose a ruler determined to restore order. In 1154, after years of civil strife, Henry of Anjou ascended the throne as Henry II, bringing with him both restoration and transformation. With his coronation, the Plantagenet dynasty was born, a line that would dominate English history for centuries. His inheritance was vast, for Henry was not only King of England, but lord of lands stretching across France, Anjou, Normandy, Aquitaine through his marriage to Eleanor, and more besides. This realm became known as the Angevin Empire, a dominion that spanned from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, making Henry one of the most powerful rulers of his age. Henry's vision was not limited to territorial might. It extended into the very structure of governance. He set about reforming the justice system, seeking to bring consistency to a land long fractured by local custom. Royal courts expanded their authority, and itinerant justices traveled the kingdom to enforce the king's law. The development of writs and procedures allowed for disputes to be settled more predictably, giving rise to what would become known as the common law. For the first time, the idea of a unified legal system took hold, binding together regions and communities under a shared framework of justice. Yet Henry's reign was not free from conflict. His determination to extend royal authority brought him into bitter dispute with Thomas Becket, his former friend and chancellor who became Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry expected Becket to support his efforts to curb the independence of the church courts, but Becket, once loyal, resisted with growing defiance. Their quarrel deepened into a clash between crown and church, testing the boundaries of power in the kingdom. Though Becket's dramatic death in Canterbury shocked Christendom and cast a shadow over Henry's reputation, it also underscored the enduring tension between secular and spiritual authority, a struggle that would shape English history for generations. Despite such strife, Henry II's reign laid enduring foundations. He established a dynasty, secured vast dominions, and redefined the relationship between king, law, and church. His energy was relentless, his ambition expansive, and his reforms lasting. When he died in 1189, he left behind both the legacy of a ruler who had rebuilt England from the chaos of the anarchy and the beginnings of conflicts that his successors would inherit. Henry II had forged a kingdom not only by power of arms, but by the enduring structures of governance and law, setting the stage for the Plantagenet era that would dominate the medieval world. From a king of law and governance, England now turned to a king of war and legend. When Henry II died in 1189, his throne passed to his son Richard, remembered in history as Richard the Lionheart. From the beginning, Richard's reign was defined not by the governance of England itself, but by his role on the grand stage of Christendom. A warrior of formidable reputation, he devoted his energy to the Third Crusade, joining the kings of France and the Holy Roman Empire in the struggle to reclaim Jerusalem. His courage and skill in battle won him admiration across Europe, and his name became legendary even among his enemies, who recognized him as a formidable opponent. Yet Richard's greatness abroad came at a cost at home. From the moment of his coronation, he treated England less as the heart of his realm than as a source of revenue for his campaigns. He spent only a handful of months in the kingdom during his 10-year reign, entrusting its administration to officials and deputies. To finance the crusade, he imposed heavy taxes, sold offices, and demanded extraordinary contributions from nobles and commoners alike. For many, the burden of his absence was felt more in coin than in protection, as England bore the financial weight of his distant ambitions. The years of his reign were marked by this tension: glory for Richard as a knightly king abroad, strain for his kingdom left behind. His exploits in the Holy Land, including his famous clashes with Saladin, secured him enduring fame, but his inability to recapture Jerusalem also revealed the limits of even the greatest crusading monarch. When he was captured on his return journey and held for ransom, England was again called upon to pay immense sums, deepening the sense that its people served as the treasury for a king who ruled more with his sword than his presence. Nevertheless, Richard's legend endured. To his contemporaries, he embodied the ideals of chivalry, bravery, honor, and the relentless pursuit of holy war. To later generations, he became a romantic figure, the lion-hearted king whose courage defined an age. Yet behind the legend lay the reality of a realm strained by neglect, where governance was secondary to the ambitions of a monarch whose gaze was fixed far beyond his own shores. When Richard died in 1199, struck while besieging a castle in France, he left little lasting legacy for England itself. The institutions that had grown under Henry II remained intact, but Richard had neither nurtured them nor extended them. What he left was reputation, a name remembered with awe across Europe, but a kingdom burdened by the cost of sustaining his legend. His reign revealed the paradox of kingship in the medieval world. A monarch could be immortalized for deeds abroad, even while leaving his own land weakened by his absence. But after Richard's legend, England would face the harsh reality of John's troubled reign. When Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, the crown passed to his younger brother John, a king whose reign would become infamous in English memory. Unlike Richard, whose reputation was forged abroad, John's rule was defined by failures at home and abroad. Failures that would force a transformation in the nature of monarchy itself. From the outset, John faced challenges. His hold on the Angevin Empire was fragile, and his conflicts with the French king Philip II soon brought disaster. By 1204, John had lost Normandy, the cradle of the Norman dynasty, along with most of the territories that had bound England to the continent. What had once been a vast dominion stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees shrank dramatically, leaving England isolated and John burdened by the humiliation of defeat. The loss of Normandy not only weakened his prestige, but also strained his relationship with the English nobility, many of whom had deep ties to lands in France. To recover his fortunes, John demanded more from his subjects. Heavy taxation, scutage payments in place of military service, and arbitrary fines angered the barons and alienated the church. His quarrel with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury led to England being placed under interdict, a punishment that suspended religious services across the land. Though eventually reconciled with the papacy, John's heavy-handedness and mistrust bred resentment on every front. The breaking point came in 1215. Faced with rebellion by his barons, John was compelled to meet them at Runnymede, on the banks of the Thames. There, he set his seal to a document that would echo through history, Magna Carta. Though written in the language of immediate grievances, taxation, justice, and the rights of the church and nobility, it contained principles that reached far beyond its time. It asserted that the king was not above the law, that he must govern with the counsel and consent of his realm. For the first time, the idea that royal power had limits was enshrined in writing. John never intended to honor the charter fully, and conflict resumed almost at once. He died in 1216, leaving the throne to his young son Henry III. Yet despite his resistance, the Magna Carta endured, reissued, and reaffirmed in the decades that followed. Over centuries, it came to symbolize the principle that kingship was bound by law, a foundation for the development of constitutional government in England and beyond. Thus, John, remembered as a failed and unpopular ruler, unwittingly gave rise to one of the most enduring legacies of English history. His reign, marked by loss and rebellion, produced a document that would outlive him and reshape the balance between crown and people. Out of his weakness was born a new strength, the principle that even the mightiest of rulers must answer to the rule of law. If John had revealed the limits of kingship, Edward would test its power on battlefield and throne alike. When Henry III's long reign ended in 1272, the crown passed to his son Edward, remembered by history as Edward I. Tall, commanding, and determined, Edward sought to strengthen royal authority and expand the reach of the English crown. His reign would be marked by conquest, ambition, and the forging of institutions that would both elevate and strain the monarchy. Edward's first great achievement was the conquest of Wales. The native princes had long resisted English domination, but Edward moved with calculated force. Through campaigns in the 1270s and 1280s, he subdued the Welsh, and by the death of the last native prince, Leolin ap Gruffudd, Wales was brought firmly under English control. To secure his conquest, Edward embarked on one of the most ambitious building programs of the Middle Ages, raising a chain of mighty stone castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and others. These fortresses, stark and imposing, were not only military strongholds, but enduring symbols of English authority over a conquered land. Yet conquest did not end at the western frontier. Edward also turned his gaze northward toward Scotland. At first invited to arbitrate a succession dispute, he soon pressed claims of overlordship, demanding recognition as Scotland's feudal superior. The Scots resisted, and conflict erupted into war. The struggle brought figures like William Wallace into defiant opposition, and though Edward's armies often triumphed on the battlefield, the wars with Scotland proved costly and inconclusive, sowing seeds of resistance that would endure long after his death. At home, Edward strengthened the machinery of royal government. He expanded the use of Parliament, summoning not only nobles and clergy, but also representatives from towns and shires, setting a precedent for broader political participation. His reforms in law and administration gave the monarchy new tools of governance, reinforcing the authority of the crown over the realm. But with greater power came greater tension. Heavy taxation to fund his wars strained relations with the nobility and the church, and resistance grew against his demands. The very institutions Edward helped to shape would one day limit his successors, for in summoning Parliament more frequently, he created a forum through which grievances could be expressed and royal power challenged. By the time Edward I died in 1307, he had left an indelible mark on the kingdom. Wales was bound to England by castles of stone and chains of law. Scotland had been drawn into a bitter struggle that would define generations. And within England itself, the structures of governance had been reshaped, simultaneously strengthening the monarchy and planting the roots of future conflict. Edward was remembered as a formidable king, both builder and warrior, whose ambitions expanded the realm, but also set the stage for battles yet to come, on the field and within the halls of power. From the ambitions of Edward I, England passed through turmoil until Edward III emerged to reclaim its glory. When Edward II's troubled reign ended in 1327, the crown passed to his young son, Edward III, a monarch whose energy and ambition would restore royal prestige and set England on a path that shaped the next century. From the beginning, Edward sought to embody the ideals of kingship that his father had failed to uphold: strength in war, splendor in court, and the assertion of England's place among the powers of Europe. The defining act of his reign came in 1337, when Edward pressed his claim to the French throne. Through his mother, Isabella of France, he argued that he was the rightful heir, challenging the rule of Philip VI. Though rooted in dynastic dispute, the claim became the spark for a wider conflict, the 100 Years' War. What began as Edward's assertion of inheritance grew into a protracted struggle between England and France, reshaping the politics and identity of both kingdoms. Edward's early campaigns were marked by stunning victories that elevated his reputation across Christendom. At Crécy in 1346, English forces, disciplined and equipped with the longbow, defeated a far larger French army. 10 years later, at Poitiers, his son, the Black Prince, captured the French king himself. These triumphs secured English footholds in France and gave Edward the image of a warrior king, leading his armies with vigor and resolve. But Edward's legacy was not only forged in battle, he also sought to craft a chivalric court that reflected the ideals of knighthood and loyalty. In 1348, he founded the Order of the Garter, a fellowship of knights bound by honor and service, which remains the most prestigious order of chivalry in England to this day. Through tournaments, pageantry, and patronage of the arts, Edward projected an image of monarchy that was both martial and magnificent, reinforcing his authority at home while enhancing his prestige abroad. The reign of Edward III thus marked a turning point. He revived the crown's standing after years of weakness, launched a war that would dominate generations, and created symbols of kingship that endured far beyond his lifetime. Yet his ambitions also bound England to a conflict of immense cost, one that would strain its resources and define its destiny for more than 100 years. Edward was remembered as the very image of a medieval king, a ruler of battles and banners, of honor and ambition, whose reign combined glory with the seeds of struggles still to come. From the glory of war, England was about to face a far greater trial, one that no sword could repel. In the midst of Edward III's reign, a catastrophe struck that would alter England more profoundly than any battle or treaty. In 1347, the first whispers of a deadly pestilence arrived from the continent. By the following year, the disease swept across the Channel, reaching English shores and spreading with terrifying speed. Between 1348 and 1351, the Black Death tore through towns and villages, leaving no corner of the kingdom untouched. The scale of the mortality was staggering. From a population of perhaps 5 million, it is believed that nearly half perished within a few short years. Parish registers fell silent. Entire families vanished, and once bustling hamlets were abandoned to weeds and silence. The impact was not simply one of grief and loss. It reshaped the very structure of society. The England that emerged after the plague was not the same kingdom that had faced it. Most profoundly, the balance between lord and peasant began to shift. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Fields lay untended, harvests rotted, and landlords faced the stark reality that without workers, their estates could not function. Surviving peasants discovered new leverage. No longer bound to accept subsistence wages, they demanded higher pay and better conditions. For the first time, laborers could bargain with their lords, and many chose to move in search of opportunity, eroding the rigid ties that had bound them to the land for generations. The crown, alarmed by this upheaval, sought to contain it. In 1351, Edward's government issued the Statute of Laborers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague, levels, and forbid workers from seeking better terms elsewhere. But necessity proved stronger than decree. Though penalties were severe, the social order could not be forced back to its former state. The experience of the plague had shifted expectations, planting the seeds of future resistance and change. The Black Death also transformed the atmosphere of daily life. With so many clergy lost, parish churches struggled to maintain spiritual order. Superstition mingled with faith, and the authority of institutions was questioned in ways both subtle and profound. At the same time, survivors inherited lands and wealth, redistributing resources in ways that undermined the old hierarchies. Out of devastation emerged a society both traumatized and invigorated, one that would never again accept its former boundaries without question. For Edward III, the plague brought an abrupt pause to the momentum of war and conquest, yet its long-term effect was to set England on a different trajectory, one where the power of ordinary people, peasants, artisans, and townsfolk would grow steadily. Though the memory of loss endured for generations, the Black Death was also a catalyst, breaking down the rigid structures of the feudal world and ushering in a society more fluid, more restless, and ultimately more modern. In those years between 1348 and 1351, England was remade not by sword or crown, but by the invisible force of disease. What rose from the ruins was a kingdom forever changed, smaller in number, sharper in awareness of life's fragility, and newly conscious of the power that even the humblest could wield in shaping the future. From the ashes of pestilence rose new tensions that would soon erupt in revolt. In the decades that followed the Black Death, England was a kingdom unsettled. Labor was scarce, wages had risen, and the bonds of feudal obligation were loosening. Yet the ruling elite sought to force the old order back into place, imposing laws to restrict movement and wages and demanding heavy taxes to fund the crown's wars in France. The discontent simmered for years until in 1381 it erupted into one of the most dramatic uprisings of medieval England, the Peasants' Revolt. The spark came with the imposition of a new poll tax, levied on rich and poor alike, falling especially hard on those already burdened by poverty. From Essex and Kent, crowds of laborers, artisans, and villagers began to gather, their anger swelling into a movement that crossed the countryside. They marched, not as a lawless mob, but under leaders who gave voice to their demands. Among them was Wat Tyler, a figure who came to symbolize the revolt, speaking for those who sought relief from oppression and recognition of their worth. As they advanced toward London, the rebels articulated clear grievances. They called for an end to serfdom, fair rents for land, and freedom from arbitrary obligations. They demanded justice in the name of equality, insisting that the wealth and privilege of the few could no longer be maintained on the backs of the many. In a society where hierarchy had long been assumed immutable, these voices rang with startling clarity. When the rebels entered the capital, they shook the foundations of royal authority. Government buildings were stormed, records destroyed, and officials targeted as symbols of corruption. The young King Richard II, only 14 at the time, confronted the uprising directly. At Mile End, he met with the rebels and, under pressure, promised reforms, concessions that acknowledged their grievances, even if only briefly. The revolt, however, could not be sustained. In the chaos that followed a second meeting at Smithfield, Wat Tyler was killed, and the momentum of the uprising dissolved. Royal forces regained control, and Richard's earlier promises were revoked. The old order reasserted itself, but not without scars. Though the revolt failed in its immediate aims, its significance endured. It revealed the growing confidence of common people to challenge authority and articulate demands for justice. The ideals voiced in 1381, freedom, fairness, and the dignity of labor, echoed far beyond the moment of their suppression. The uprising stood as a warning to rulers that the governed were not without power, and as a reminder that the social order forged in the wake of the Black Death could not easily be forced back into its old mold. The Peasants' Revolt was a fleeting storm, but it left behind a horizon forever altered. It marked the beginning of a new awareness in English society, a recognition that even those at the bottom could rise to assert their place in the kingdom's story. But England's story did not end in unrest. Within decades, a warrior king would rise to restore its pride. When Henry V came to the throne in 1413, England was weary from internal discord, yet still bound to the long struggle with France. From the start, Henry revealed a clarity of purpose and a discipline of mind that set him apart from many of his predecessors. Devout yet pragmatic, stern yet charismatic, he embodied the image of a warrior king at a time when England yearned for unity and triumph. His moment of destiny arrived in 1415, when he renewed England's claim to the French crown and led his army across the Channel. The campaign was fraught with hardship. Disease and fatigue thinned his forces, and the French mustered a host that far outnumbered the English. Yet, on the muddy fields near the village of Agincourt, Henry's leadership turned adversity into legend. The English longbowmen, positioned behind stakes and protected by discipline, unleashed volleys that devastated the advancing French knights. Against overwhelming odds, the English achieved a stunning victory. Agincourt became not merely a battlefield success, but a symbol of English resilience, and Henry himself emerged as the very model of kingly courage. The triumph at Agincourt was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Henry pressed his advantage with relentless determination. Campaign after campaign extended English control deep into French territory. His victories were not just military, but diplomatic, culminating in the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. By its terms, Henry was recognized as heir to the French throne and regent of the kingdom, disinheriting the Dauphin Charles. The union of the two crowns seemed within reach, a dream that for a moment placed England at the center of European power. Henry's achievements were remarkable not only for their scale, but for the sense of order they imposed on a fractured realm. At home, his successes rallied nobles and commons alike behind the crown, quelling the divisions that had long weakened the monarchy. Abroad, he was respected and feared in equal measure, a monarch who commanded both the battlefield and the negotiating table. Yet Henry's triumphs were shadowed by brevity. In 1422, at the height of his power, he died suddenly at the age of 35, leaving an infant son as his successor. The dream of a united Anglo-French monarchy, so close to realization, slipped away in the struggles that followed. Still, Henry V's reign remained etched in memory as a golden chapter when one king's determination and military genius gave England a taste of glory unmatched before or since. Yet triumph on the battlefield was followed by decline as the crown passed to a child unready for the weight of two kingdoms. The promise of Henry V's victories faded quickly after his death. His infant son, Henry VI, inherited not only two crowns, but also the immense burden of sustaining them. Too young to rule and later too weak to command, Henry VI presided over the slow unraveling of English fortunes in France. By the mid-15th century, nearly all the gains of his father were lost, and the English crown, once poised to dominate Europe, had shrunk back to its island. At home, weakness bred division. Henry VI's gentle nature and bouts of illness left him unable to manage the ambitions of the great noble families. Rivalries between the powerful houses of Lancaster and York hardened into open hostility. Each claimed legitimacy through descent from Edward III, and each gathered supporters who saw in the conflict a chance to settle old grievances or secure new power. The struggle erupted in 1455 at the Battle of St. Albans, the first clash in what would come to be called the Wars of the Roses. For 3 decades, England was torn by intermittent civil war. Kings were made and unmade by force of arms. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York became the emblems of a conflict that was as much about power and survival as it was about dynastic right. Among the many turns of this bloody contest, figures rose to prominence whose names echo in history. Richard, Duke of York, who first challenged the Lancastrian king, his son Edward, who seized the throne as Edward IV, and Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's indomitable queen, who fought with relentless determination to preserve her husband's crown. The fortunes of war shifted repeatedly, victories turning to defeats, exiles becoming triumphant returns. By 1485, the wars had exhausted the realm. On the field of Bosworth, the last act played out. Richard III, the final Yorkist king, was defeated and killed, and Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant, ascended the throne as Henry VII. With his victory, the Wars of the Roses ended, and a new dynasty began. The Tudors, who would bring a fragile but lasting stability to a kingdom scarred by decades of strife. The Wars of the Roses were more than a dynastic feud. They reshaped the nature of kingship, reducing the power of overmighty nobles and paving the way for a stronger monarchy. They also left behind a sense of deep national weariness, a desire for unity after generations of division. Out of the turmoil emerged a new age, one that would see England turn from civil war to renewal under the Tudor crown. The end of the Wars of the Roses was not merely a conclusion, but the dawn of the Tudor age. When the crown was placed upon Henry Tudor's head after Bosworth in 1485, it marked not only the end of Richard III, but the close of decades of civil war. England, weary of the Wars of the Roses, looked to this new monarch for stability and peace. As Henry VII, he set about building a dynasty that would mend the fractured kingdom and restore confidence in the monarchy. The first step toward unity was symbolic yet profound. In 1486, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. By uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York, he fused the rival houses whose struggle had devastated the realm. Their union produced the Tudor Rose, a new emblem that embodied reconciliation and the promise of renewal. Through this marriage, Henry transformed personal alliance into national healing, giving the kingdom a potent symbol of unity. But Henry's achievement went beyond ceremony. He proved himself a cautious and shrewd ruler, determined to strengthen royal authority. He curtailed the influence of overmighty nobles, limiting their private armies and imposing financial bonds to keep their loyalty in check. He revived the royal finances, carefully managing revenue and ensuring the crown lived within its means, a stark contrast to the extravagance and instability of earlier reigns. Through prudence and calculation, he transformed a fragile monarchy into one that stood on firmer ground. Henry also sought to rebuild England's standing abroad. He pursued careful diplomacy, securing alliances through marriage and treaties rather than costly wars. His eldest son, Arthur, was wed to Catherine of Aragon, tying England to Spain, while other agreements stabilized relations with Scotland and France. Where his predecessors had drained resources in continental campaigns, Henry preferred peace and trade, laying the foundations for prosperity that his successors would inherit. The reign of Henry VII was not without unease. Pretenders like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck challenged his claim, exploiting lingering loyalties to Yorkist blood. Yet Henry's steady resolve and effective use of both force and negotiation neutralized these threats. Each failed rebellion only reinforced the sense that the Tudors were now secure upon the throne. By the time of his death in 1509, Henry VII had achieved what few before him had managed. He had brought peace to a land torn apart by civil war, strengthened the crown, and established a dynasty that would dominate the next century of English history. He was not remembered for dramatic battles or flamboyant displays, but for his quiet determination, caution, and vision. Henry VII left to his son a kingdom stable, solvent, and prepared for greatness. Upon his death, the crown passed to his son, a young king whose reign would prove far more turbulent. When Henry VIII succeeded his father in 1509, he was young, vigorous, and full of promise. Handsome and athletic, he seemed the embodiment of Renaissance kingship, a monarch who could command the battlefield, dazzle the court, and hold his own in the diplomacy of Europe. Yet his long reign would be remembered less for its early splendor than for the profound transformation it wrought upon the kingdom, reshaping religion, politics, and the very identity of England. At the heart of Henry's story lay his marriages. 6 queens would stand beside him in turn, each alliance shaping the course of his rule. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, gave him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving son. Obsessed with securing a male heir, Henry pressed for an annulment from the Pope. When Rome refused, Henry took a step that changed history. Breaking with centuries of tradition, he severed ties with the papacy and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Thus, the English Reformation began not from theology alone, but from a king's personal quest for dynastic security. The consequences were sweeping. Monasteries, long pillars of English religious and social life, were dissolved. Their lands and wealth flowed into the crown, strengthening royal finances while dismantling institutions that had shaped communities for centuries. Parish life was disrupted, traditional devotions suppressed, and the landscape of faith was remade. The king's authority now extended into the spiritual realm, fusing crown and church in a way that placed unprecedented power in his hands. Henry wielded that power with determination. His later marriages to Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr reflected not only personal choices, but also political and religious shifts. Jane Seymour bore him the long-desired son Edward, but she died soon after, leaving Henry to continue his relentless pursuit of stability through dynastic alliances. Each queen brought triumphs and turmoil, and the drama of Henry's household became inseparable from the fate of the kingdom. Beyond religion and marriage, Henry's reign was marked by his forceful diplomacy and personal command. He sought to place England at the center of European politics, balancing alliances with France and Spain, while asserting independence from papal influence. His court became a stage for Renaissance culture, filled with music, pageantry, and humanist learning, even as it remained overshadowed by intrigue and fear of the king's unpredictable will. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry VIII had left behind a kingdom profoundly altered. The Church of England was established, the monasteries were gone, and royal authority stood higher than ever before. He had secured a male heir, but also left daughters whose claims would ensure continued uncertainty. Above all, he had set in motion changes that would ripple through English life for generations, defining politics, religion, and monarchy in new and enduring ways. Henry VIII was remembered not only as the king with 6 wives, but as a ruler who reshaped a nation by placing his personal will at the center of its destiny. His reign stood as both a triumph of royal power and a reminder of its costs, a chapter where England itself was remade under the force of one man's ambition. But with Henry's death, the power he had so jealously held passed to a boy of 9, ushering in a reign shaped not by the king himself, but by those who ruled in his name. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the crown passed to his 9-year-old son, Edward VI. Too young to rule in his own right, the boy king's reign was guided by regents, yet the years of his short rule became a decisive moment in the shaping of English religion. Where Henry had broken with Rome but preserved much of traditional practice, Edward's government moved boldly toward Protestant reform, embedding changes that would leave a lasting mark. Under the guidance of his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the kingdom witnessed sweeping changes. The Latin Mass was replaced with services in English, and the Book of Common Prayer was introduced in 1549, making worship accessible in the vernacular. Images were stripped from churches, altars removed, and ceremonies simplified, reflecting the theology of reformers who sought to purify faith from what they saw as superstition. For many, these changes brought clarity and a sense of renewal. For others, they represented upheaval and loss. Edward himself, though frail in health, was devout and deeply committed to the Protestant cause. He studied theology with seriousness, uncommon for his age, and saw his kingship as a divine mission to secure the Reformation. Though his reign lasted only 6 years, it accelerated the transformation of England into a Protestant nation, reshaping not only liturgy, but also the cultural and spiritual identity of the realm. By 1553, illness claimed the young king, cutting short his rule before he reached adulthood. His death opened a contested succession, plunging the kingdom once more into uncertainty. Yet even in his brevity, Edward VI's reign had pushed England decisively away from its Catholic past. The reforms of his years endured, ensuring that the Reformation in England was not a passing moment, but a foundation upon which future generations would build. Yet Edward's passing reopened the question of succession, bringing to power a queen whose vision was the mirror opposite of his own. When Edward VI died in 1553, the crown passed to his elder half-sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. For Mary, her reign was more than a matter of dynastic succession. It was a mission to restore the faith of her mother and the nation she believed had strayed from God. With determination and conviction, she moved quickly to return England to the Catholic fold, re-establishing papal authority and reinstating traditional forms of worship. At first, many welcomed her efforts. Years of religious upheaval had left communities divided, and for some, the familiar rituals of the Catholic Church offered comfort and continuity. Parliament repealed Protestant legislation, and ties with Rome were renewed. For Mary, this was not only an act of faith, but also of identity. She sought to heal the breach that her father had created and bring England back into the heart of Christendom. Yet her resolve soon hardened into severity. Determined to stamp out heresy, Mary's government launched prosecutions against leading Protestants. Bishops and preachers who resisted the return to Rome were arrested and, in many cases, executed. These actions, intended to restore unity, instead deepened division. Though she ruled only 5 years, the burnings of Protestant martyrs during her reign left scars that would define her legacy, earning her the grim sobriquet Bloody Mary in later generations. Her marriage to Philip of Spain also stirred unease. Intended to strengthen England's Catholic alliance with Europe's most powerful kingdom, it instead fueled suspicion that the country was being drawn into Spanish influence. Mary's inability to produce an heir further undermined her position, leaving the succession open to her Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth. By the time of Mary's death in 1558, her dream of a Catholic restoration had faltered. The institutions she revived would not endure beyond her reign, swept aside by the tide of Protestantism that followed. Yet her rule was pivotal. It revealed the intensity of religious divisions in England and ensured that the question of faith would dominate the reign of her successor. Mary III was remembered not simply as a queen of harsh measures, but as a ruler who embodied the turbulence of a nation caught between two faiths. Her reign was brief, but it underscored that the English Reformation was not a straight path, but a struggle. One fought with conviction and one that left the kingdom forever changed. Thus, as Mary's reign closed in disappointment, the hopes of the kingdom turned to the young Elizabeth. When Mary I died in 1558, the crown passed to her half-sister Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. At 25 years old, Elizabeth inherited a kingdom divided by faith, weakened by costly wars, and uncertain of its future. Yet, in the 45 years that followed, she would not only stabilize her realm, but also preside over one of the most celebrated eras in English history. Elizabeth styled herself as the Virgin Queen, wedded not to any man, but to her country. In a time when marriage was expected of queens, she used her unmarried status as a tool of diplomacy, keeping European powers guessing while asserting her independence. At home, she crafted a religious settlement that steered a middle path between Catholic and Protestant extremes. The Elizabethan Church retained enough ceremony to comfort traditionalists while affirming Protestant doctrine and royal supremacy. Though not without opposition, this settlement endured, offering the stability her people longed for after years of turmoil. Her reign was tested by the great rivalries of the age. Spain, under King Philip II, became England's most formidable adversary. Religious tension, political intrigue, and the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, all pushed the two nations toward inevitable conflict. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed to invade England. Outnumbered, Elizabeth's navy, commanded by men like Sir Francis Drake, used speed, strategy, and the winds of fortune to repel the mighty fleet. The Armada's defeat was more than a military victory. It was a defining moment that secured England's independence from Catholic domination in Europe and elevated Elizabeth as a symbol of national strength. Elizabeth's rule was not only about war and survival, it was also about cultural brilliance. The Elizabethan age became a golden era of literature, drama, and the arts. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and countless others gave voice to a flowering of creativity that enriched the language and imagination of England. Music and architecture flourished, courtly pageantry dazzled, and the sense of a shared national identity deepened through culture as much as through politics. The Queen also oversaw the first steps of England's global expansion. Voyages led by explorers such as Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake carried the English flag across the Atlantic and around the world. Colonies were attempted in the New World, tentative at first but prophetic of England's future as a global power. Though many ventures faltered, they marked the beginning of an age in which England would no longer look only inward, but outward, toward the seas and distant horizons. Elizabeth's reign was not without challenges. Plots and conspiracies threatened her life. Parliament pressed for influence, and economic strains grew with time. Yet, through careful judgment, charisma, and a talent for balancing factions, she maintained authority and inspired loyalty. Her speeches, particularly her address to the troops at Tilbury during the Armada crisis, revealed a monarch who understood the power of words as much as arms, binding her people to her cause with eloquence and resolve. By the time she died in 1603, Elizabeth had ruled for nearly half a century, leaving behind a kingdom more stable, prosperous, and confident than the one she had inherited. She was remembered not only as a queen who steered England through danger, but also as the architect of a cultural and national identity that would endure long after her death. The Elizabethan age was more than a chapter in history. It was a legend shaped by the vision and will of a queen who made her reign synonymous with England's golden moment. But with Elizabeth's death, the Tudor age came to an end, and a new dynasty was about to begin. When Elizabeth I died in 1603 without an heir, the Tudor line ended, and the crown passed peacefully to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the first time, England and Scotland shared the same monarch, an event known as the Union of the Crowns. Though the two kingdoms remained legally distinct, this union under one king marked a turning point, sowing the seeds of a future united kingdom. James styled himself as a peacemaker, eager to unite his realms under a single vision, though the practical difficulties of merging two proud nations soon became apparent. James I brought with him the experience of ruling Scotland, and he was an intellectual king, fascinated by theology, scholarship, and the philosophy of monarchy. One of his most enduring contributions came in 1611 with the commissioning of the King James Bible. This English translation of the scriptures, produced by a committee of scholars, blended accuracy with literary beauty. Its cadences and phrasing would shape the English language for centuries, becoming not only a religious text, but also a cultural landmark, read and quoted in households, churches, and literature across the realm. Yet James's reign was not without friction. His belief in the divine right of kings often put him at odds with Parliament. Where Elizabeth had balanced authority with pragmatism, James pressed his claim more openly, insisting that kings answered only to God. Parliament, increasingly assertive in matters of taxation and governance, resisted these assertions. The tension between Crown and Commons grew steadily, foreshadowing the greater conflicts that would erupt under his son. Religious divisions also persisted. While James sought moderation between Catholics and Protestants, suspicions and resentments remained high. The infamous Gunpowder Plot of 1605, in which conspirators sought to destroy king and parliament in one stroke, revealed the volatility of the age. Though foiled, it hardened anti-Catholic sentiment and underscored the fragility of national unity in a kingdom still scarred by decades of religious turmoil. Despite challenges, James's reign was one of relative peace. He ended the long war with Spain, patronized the arts, and presided over a court that was both cultured and controversial. Playwrights such as William Shakespeare and Ben Jonson flourished under his rule, while the masque became a favored form of court entertainment. Yet beneath the pageantry and scholarship lay unresolved tensions between monarch and parliament, between religious factions, between the desire for union and the reality of division. When James died in 1625, he left his son Charles a kingdom outwardly stable but inwardly unsettled. His vision of strong monarchy, cultural patronage, and religious moderation had left its mark, but so too had the seeds of conflict. The reign of James I was a bridge between the Tudor world of Elizabeth and the storm that would come with the Stuarts, a reign of learning, ambition, and uneasy peace, remembered as both a moment of promise and a prelude to upheaval. What James managed to keep in check, Charles would see spiral into open conflict. When James I died in 1625, the crown passed to his son Charles, a king whose reign would prove one of the most turbulent in English history. Unlike his father, Charles I lacked the flexibility to navigate the growing assertiveness of Parliament. Reserved, principled, and convinced of the divine authority of kingship, he demanded obedience at a time when the political nation increasingly sought a voice. The clash between royal will and parliamentary rights soon became the central drama of his rule. Money lay at the heart of the conflict. Charles needed funds to support his government and wars, yet he frequently tried to bypass Parliament to raise them, relying on forced loans, ship money, and other controversial measures. These acts stirred anger across the kingdom, for they touched not only the nobility, but merchants and commoners as well. Parliament, summoned and dismissed in cycles of frustration, insisted that taxation required its consent. The dispute grew into a broader contest over sovereignty. Who truly held authority in England, the king or the representatives of his people? Religion sharpened these tensions. Charles married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess, arousing suspicion among his Protestant subjects. His support for Archbishop Laud's reforms, emphasizing ceremony and hierarchy, convinced many that he leaned dangerously close to Catholic practice. In Scotland, efforts to impose a new prayer book provoked outrage, sparking the bishops' wars and drawing the northern kingdom into open resistance. The conflict drained royal finances and forced Charles reluctantly to recall Parliament. By 1642, the divisions could no longer be contained. Charles and Parliament raised armies, and the English Civil War began. Families, towns, and counties were split between royalists who stood by the king and parliamentarians who demanded reform. What followed was not a single conflict, but a series of wars fought across England, Scotland, and Ireland, reshaping the politics of the entire archipelago. The war brought forward new leaders and new ideas. Parliament's forces, eventually organized into the disciplined New Model Army, challenged the king's cause with growing effectiveness. The struggle was not only about politics, but about the very principles of governance and faith. By the end of the 1640s, Charles's cause faltered, and the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Charles I's reign ended not in reconciliation, but in revolution. His steadfast belief in the divine right of kings left him unable to compromise, and his conflicts with Parliament unleashed a war that redefined the English state. In 1649, he faced trial and execution, an unprecedented moment in European monarchy when a king was judged by his people. With his death, the monarchy itself was abolished, and England entered a new, uncharted experiment in republican rule. Charles I was remembered as a tragic figure, principled yet inflexible, whose vision of kingship collided fatally with the changing currents of his age. His reign was both an ending and a beginning, the collapse of the old order and the uncertain birth of a new one, forged in the fire of civil war. From the scaffold at Whitehall began a new order, one that replaced the crown with Parliament and the sword. The execution of Charles I in 1649 sent shockwaves across Europe. For the first time, an anointed king had been tried and condemned by his own subjects, and England stood without a monarch. In its place arose the Commonwealth, a republican experiment that sought to redefine the nation's governance. At its heart was Parliament, yet the true power soon gravitated toward the army, and its most formidable leader, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell had risen from relative obscurity, a country gentleman turned soldier whose discipline and fervent Protestant faith made him a commanding presence in the civil wars. As a general of the new model army, he had secured Parliament's victories, and after the king's death, he emerged as the figure best equipped to guide the fragile republic. The early Commonwealth was unsettled. Royalist uprisings threatened at home, while Ireland and Scotland resisted the new regime. Cromwell led campaigns across the Irish Sea and into the Scottish Highlands, defeating opposition with relentless determination. These wars were brutal and costly, leaving deep scars, but they secured the Commonwealth's survival and extended its reach across the British Isles. In London, Parliament struggled to maintain unity. Divisions between moderates and radicals, between civilian leaders and the army, made governance unstable. In 1653, Cromwell dissolved the Rump Parliament and assumed authority as Lord Protector, inaugurating the Protectorate. Though never crowned, he ruled with many of the powers of a king, seeking to combine firm leadership with a godly vision of reform. His government emphasized moral discipline, religious toleration for Protestants, and the strengthening of trade and the navy. Under his rule, England expanded its influence overseas, challenging Dutch power and laying the groundwork for future imperial ambitions. Yet Cromwell's protectorate was fraught with contradiction. He rejected monarchy in name, but wielded monarchical authority in practice. His reliance on the army bred resentment, and his attempts at religious reform divided as much as they united. For some, he was a deliverer who saved England from tyranny. For others, he was a dictator cloaked in piety. When Cromwell died in 1658, the experiment in republican rule faltered. His son Richard lacked his father's authority, and within 2 years the monarchy was restored under Charles II. The Commonwealth and Protectorate, though short-lived, had left a profound legacy. They had demonstrated that kings could be challenged, that governance could be reimagined, and that the balance between authority and liberty would forever be contested. The age of Cromwell was one of paradox, discipline and disorder, vision and division. It was a chapter when England, for a brief and extraordinary moment, lived without a king, testing the boundaries of power and principle in ways that would echo for centuries to come. With Cromwell gone, the republic he built soon unraveled, and the nation turned back to the crown. When Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, the fragile experiment of republican rule began to collapse. His son Richard lacked both the authority and the vision to hold the Commonwealth together, and the army, divided among its factions, could not provide stability. After years of uncertainty, England yearned for the familiar figure of monarchy. In 1660, the exiled Charles, son of the executed king, was invited to return, and the monarchy was restored. His entry into London was greeted with jubilation, the crowds cheering as though the kingdom itself had awoken from a long and troubled dream. Charles II, known as the Merry Monarch, embodied a striking contrast to the austere years of Puritan rule. His court was lively, filled with music, theater, and wit. The theaters, once closed, reopened with vigor, and the arts flourished under his patronage. Yet his reign was not without shadows. Beneath the pageantry lay deep scars from years of conflict and division, and challenges soon arose that tested the resilience of the restored crown. The 1660s brought calamities that struck at the heart of the nation. In 1665, the Great Plague swept through London, claiming thousands of lives and spreading fear across the city. Just a year later, disaster struck again with the Great Fire of 1666. Flames raged through the capital, destroying much of its medieval core, including St. Paul's Cathedral. For many, it seemed as though divine judgment had fallen on the city, yet out of ashes came renewal. London was rebuilt with broader streets, sturdier houses, and grander designs, reshaping the capital into the modern age. Charles himself faced political storms. His efforts to balance religious toleration with the expectations of a Protestant nation drew suspicion, especially given his Catholic sympathies and secret dealings with France. Parliament, emboldened by past struggles, pressed for limits on royal power, and the uneasy partnership between king and commons became a defining feature of his reign. Despite the turmoil, Charles II left a mark of resilience and transformation. His reign restored monarchy, not as the unchecked power of his father, but as an institution bound more tightly to the realities of Parliament and the shifting tides of public opinion. The disasters of plague and fire scarred his era, yet they also ushered in renewal and adaptation. When Charles died in 1685, the monarchy was once again secure, though not unchallenged. His return had closed the chapter of Republican experiment, but the questions raised during those years, the balance of power between Crown and Parliament, the role of religion, and the shape of national identity, remained unresolved. Charles II's reign was one of survival and rebuilding, remembered as a time when England, emerging from war and experiment, rediscovered both its monarchy and its capacity to endure. From restoration to revolution, the Stuart story now turned to Charles's brother, James. When Charles II died in 1685, the crown passed to his brother James, a man whose reign would be short yet transformative. James II came to the throne with clear intentions. He believed in strong royal authority and openly practiced the Catholic faith. In a kingdom where memories of religious conflict were still raw, his faith was enough to stir unease, and his determination to advance Catholic interests soon set him on a collision course with his people. At first, many hoped James's rule might bring stability. He was experienced, decisive, and respected for his service as a naval commander. Yet his efforts to appoint Catholics to positions of influence, his attempts to suspend laws passed by Parliament, and his promotion of religious tolerance through royal decree alarmed both Protestants and defenders of parliamentary rights. To his subjects, it seemed that James was not only favoring Catholicism, but also threatening the constitutional balance that had slowly taken shape since the Civil War. The birth of a son in 1688 turned anxiety into crisis. Until then, many had assumed that James's Protestant daughter Mary, married to William of Orange, would eventually succeed him. A Catholic male heir, however, raised the prospect of a permanent Catholic dynasty. For England's Protestant establishment, this was intolerable. A group of nobles and political leaders extended a secret invitation to William and Mary to intervene and take the throne. In November 1688, William landed in England with a Dutch army. What followed was not a bloody struggle, but a swift collapse of James's authority. Soldiers, nobles, and even members of his own family abandoned him. James fled into exile, and the throne was declared vacant. This moment, later celebrated as the Glorious Revolution, was not only a change of monarch, but a redefinition of monarchy itself. In 1689, William and Mary were offered the crown by Parliament, but on conditions that forever altered the balance of power. They accepted the Bill of Rights, a landmark document that enshrined the supremacy of Parliament over the crown. It guaranteed regular sessions of Parliament, free elections, and protections for subjects against arbitrary rule. No longer could a monarch suspend laws or levy taxes without consent. England had become, in effect, a constitutional monarchy. The Glorious Revolution was a turning point. It ended the long struggle between Crown and Parliament, ensuring that the monarchy would henceforth rule in partnership with the representatives of the people. It secured the Protestant succession, binding religion to politics in ways that shaped the coming century. Above all, it established principles of governance, accountability, limits on power, and the rule of law that would echo far beyond England's shores. James II left as he had lived, steadfast in his beliefs but unable to bend to the will of his kingdom. In his place, William and Mary inaugurated a new order. The Revolution of 1688 to 1689 was not fought with great battles, but with decisions, documents, and the quiet transfer of authority. Yet its consequences were profound. England had chosen a new path, one in which monarchy endured not as an absolute command, but as a constitutional framework, forever changed by the will of its people. Thus, having redefined the monarchy and bound it to Parliament, the kingdom now turned toward a broader horizon, the dawn of empire and industry. The dawn of the 18th century marked a new chapter for the kingdom that had once been England alone. In 1707, with the Act of Union, England and Scotland were bound together under a single parliament, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. The crowns had been united since James I a century earlier, but now the two realms became one political entity. This union was not merely a matter of law, it signaled the birth of a state that would, in the coming centuries, shape the world. For Scotland, it opened doors to imperial trade and opportunity. For England, it secured the northern frontier. Together, the island's peoples entered the 18th century with ambitions far beyond their shores. The century was an age of empire, defined by Britain's struggle and rivalry with France. Both powers sought dominance not only in Europe, but across the globe, in the Americas, in Asia, and on the seas that linked them. Britain's ascent as a naval power gave it an advantage that would prove decisive. From the War of the Spanish Succession at the century's start, where victories at Blenheim and Gibraltar underscored its reach, to the later conflicts of the mid-century, Britain honed the art of war at sea and learned to project force far from home. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, marked the culmination of this struggle. Sometimes called the First World War, it was fought from the forests of North America to the coasts of India. Britain's navy, disciplined and daring, blockaded enemies and protected trade routes, while generals such as James Wolfe secured victories abroad. In 1763, with the Treaty of Paris, Britain emerged as the preeminent global power. France's empire was curtailed, while Britain's dominions stretched from Canada to the Caribbean and footholds in India. The island nation, once vulnerable to invasion, now commanded the seas and held the beginnings of a global empire. Yet empire was not without cost. The vast territories required governance, taxation, and defense, and it was in this context that Britain faced one of its gravest challenges. Across the Atlantic, the 13 American colonies, long accustomed to a measure of autonomy, began to resist what they saw as overreach. Disputes over taxation and representation deepened into confrontation. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence severed the bond, and a bitter war ensued. Despite Britain's military might, distance, determination, and French support for the Americans led to defeat. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized the United States as independent, and Britain had lost its greatest colonial possession. The loss was a wound to pride, but it was also a lesson. Britain turned its attention to other parts of its empire, to India, Africa, and the Pacific, where new opportunities awaited. The American Revolution underscored that empire could not be sustained by force alone. It required negotiation, adaptation, and often compromise. Out of failure came resilience, and Britain's imperial story continued, reshaped by experience. Even as Britain's global fortunes shifted, at home, another revolution was underway, one not fought with muskets or fleets, but with steam, coal, and iron. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in the late 18th century, transformed the island more radically than any conquest. In workshops and fields, in mines and mills, innovations began to gather momentum. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine provided power that could drive machines far beyond the capacity of human or animal labor. Textile mills sprang up in towns like Manchester and Leeds, harnessing mechanical looms to produce cloth on a scale unimaginable in earlier generations. Coal fueled this new world. Mines dug deep into the earth supplied the energy to feed steam engines, smelt iron, and fire the furnaces of industry. The landscape itself began to change. Canals carved through the countryside, linking industrial towns to ports, while new factories dominated skylines once marked only by church spires. The consequences were profound. A new working class emerged, drawn from villages into the growing industrial cities. Families left traditional rural life for the promise of wages in mills and mines. Urban centers expanded rapidly, their streets crowded and often squalid, but alive with the rhythms of modern industry. The social fabric was transformed as the old agrarian order gave way to a society shaped by wage labor, machines, and commerce. With industrialization came opportunity and hardship alike. Entrepreneurs and inventors found wealth, while workers endured long hours and dangerous conditions. The city became both a place of promise and a crucible of inequality. Yet out of these conditions grew new forms of solidarity, new calls for reform, and the beginnings of the labor movement. By the century's close, Britain stood at a unique threshold. It was a nation that had lost colonies but gained an empire, a state forged by union at home, yet defined by expansion abroad, and a society remade by machines, trade, and restless energy. The 18th century was not merely an age of kings and wars, but the crucible in which modern Britain was forged, an island power transformed into the workshop and, increasingly, the engine of the world. Having endured loss abroad and revolution at home, Britain entered the 19th century stronger, more ambitious, and prepared to shape the modern world. The 19th century opened with Britain already transformed. The Industrial Revolution had begun to recast society, and the empire stretched across oceans, yet the century ahead would magnify both industry and empire to an unprecedented scale. This was the age of Victoria, a queen whose reign of more than 60 years became synonymous with Britain's rise as the foremost power in the world. It was an age of iron and steam, of cities swollen with factories and workers, of distant colonies stitched together by ships and telegraphs, and of a nation wrestling with both its greatness and its conscience. At home, the pulse of change was relentless. Factories multiplied and railways carved through the countryside, binding town to town in iron lines. The steam locomotive, roaring across bridges and valleys, shrank distances and redefined the rhythm of life. Cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool became symbols of industrial might, their skies clouded by smoke and their streets filled with the clamor of industry. London, ever the heart of the nation, grew into the world's largest city, a hub of finance, politics, and culture. Industrial progress reshaped society in profound ways. A new middle class of merchants, manufacturers, and professionals rose to prominence, claiming influence once reserved for landowning aristocrats. At the same time, a vast working class toiled in mills, mines, and workshops, enduring long hours and harsh conditions. Reform became the watchword of the century. The Reform Acts gradually extended the vote, first to middle-class men, then more broadly to workers, as Britain inched toward democracy. Trade unions organized, seeking protection and fair wages, while writers and thinkers gave voice to social critique. From Charles Dickens's vivid depictions of poverty to John Stuart Mill's calls for liberty and equality, religion and morality provided a framework for this changing world. The Victorian age was marked by a deep sense of duty, propriety, and moral earnestness. Churches, chapels, and missionary societies proliferated, linking faith with social reform. Campaigns against child labor, for education, and for the abolition of slavery all drew strength from a moral vision of improvement. Yet alongside high ideals ran the tensions of hypocrisy, as rigid codes of respectability often masked the inequalities of industrial society. Abroad, Britain's empire expanded to a scale never before imagined. India, already under the control of the East India Company, came under direct crown rule after the uprising of 1857, becoming the jewel in the crown of the empire. In Africa, explorers mapped vast territories, and by the century's close, Britain controlled swathes of land from Cairo to Cape Town. In Asia and the Pacific, ports and colonies extended Britain's reach, while dominions such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand grew under British influence. By the end of Victoria's reign, the empire covered a quarter of the globe, its territories linked by shipping routes, railways, and the undersea telegraph. The empire was a source of immense pride, but also deep controversy. For many, it was a symbol of Britain's mission to spread civilization, commerce, and Christianity. For others, it was a system of exploitation built on conquest and economic domination. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace in London, showcased the marvels of industry and empire, presenting Britain as the workshop of the world. Yet behind the glass and steel lay the realities of colonial rule, of resistance abroad, and inequality at home. The century was also shaped by conflict. The Napoleonic Wars at its beginning had tested Britain's endurance and ended with triumph at Waterloo in 1815, establishing Britain as Europe's leading power. Later, wars in Crimea, South Africa, and China revealed both the reach and the limits of imperial might. The Royal Navy, ruling the seas, was the empire's backbone, ensuring the flow of goods, troops, and communication across the globe. Science and culture flourished alongside industry and empire. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution challenged traditional beliefs and reshaped how humanity understood its place in the world. Advances in medicine, engineering, and technology transformed daily life, from anesthesia in surgery to gaslight in city streets. Literature flowered, with the works of the Bronte sisters, Thomas Hardy and George Eliot, capturing the struggles of individuals in a changing society. Poetry and painting echoed the grandeur and anxiety of an age both confident and uncertain. Victoria herself became a symbol of continuity. Ascending the throne in 1837 as a young queen, she grew into a matriarch, revered and respected across the empire. Her long reign, marked by both personal tragedies and public triumphs, embodied the stability that many cherished in an age of rapid change. The image of the queen, stern yet maternal, lent the empire a human face, binding distant lands to the throne in London. By the century's close, Britain stood at its zenith. It was the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth, its empire vast, its industry unrivaled, its navy supreme. Yet beneath the grandeur, new challenges stirred. The working class demanded more rights, Ireland pressed for autonomy, and rival powers such as Germany and the United States began to challenge Britain's supremacy. The seeds of future conflict were being sown, even as Victorians celebrated their achievements with confidence. The 19th century was a paradox of progress and inequality, of empire and conscience, of faith and doubt. It was an age when Britain reshaped not only itself but much of the world, leaving legacies of railways, laws, languages, and institutions, as well as wounds of division and exploitation. It was the century when Britain became the first truly global power, its influence stretching into every corner of the earth. And it was the century that prepared the stage for the struggles and transformations of the modern world. Yet the very forces that had elevated Britain in the 19th century now set the stage for the 20th, a century that would test its resilience as never before. The 20th century opened with Britain still the greatest empire on earth, its flag flying over territories on every continent, its navy unrivaled, and its wealth vast. Yet beneath the grandeur, the forces of change were stirring. Industry and empire had brought prosperity, but also inequality, restlessness, and the rise of new powers abroad. The century that followed would test Britain's resilience as no other had before, a time of world wars, social upheaval, and the slow retreat of imperial dominion. At the dawn of the century, the empire seemed secure, but the Boer War in South Africa, 1899 to 1902, foreshadowed the difficulties ahead. Though Britain triumphed, the struggle revealed how costly and contentious overseas wars could be, and it exposed divisions at home. Still, Britain entered the new century with confidence, basking in the wealth of industry and the reach of empire, while London remained the beating heart of global finance. The First World War shattered that certainty. When conflict erupted in 1914, Britain joined alongside France and Russia against Germany and its allies. Millions of men were mobilized, and the empire rallied to the cause, sending soldiers from Canada, Australia, India, and beyond. The war consumed lives and treasure on a scale unimaginable, but it also reshaped society. Women entered factories and fields in vast numbers, altering gender roles, while soldiers returned with new expectations of fairness and reform. In 1918, victory came, but it was bitter, bought at immense cost. The war left Britain exhausted, burdened with debt, and presiding over a restless empire where calls for independence grew louder. The interwar years brought both hope and hardship. The 1920s and 1930s saw economic booms and devastating slumps, strikes and protests. As the old certainties of empire and aristocracy faltered, Ireland broke away in 1921, leaving the United Kingdom reduced, while nationalist movements stirred in India and the Middle East. At home, the extension of the vote created a mass democracy as labor rose alongside conservatives and liberals to reshape the political landscape. The cultural life of Britain, from modernist writers like Virginia Woolf to the innovations of cinema and broadcasting, reflected a nation searching for meaning in a changed world. But the greatest trial was still to come. In 1939, Britain again faced Germany, now under the menace of fascism. The Second World War tested every resource of the nation. With Winston Churchill at the helm, Britain endured the Blitz, fought on sea and in the skies, and with its allies turned the tide of global conflict. Once again, the empire rallied, providing troops, resources, and bases across the world. In 1945, victory came, but the cost was staggering. Britain was triumphant, yet it was no longer the dominant power it had once been. The United States and the Soviet Union now stood as global superpowers, while Britain was left weakened, its empire under strain. The post-war years were marked by both decline and renewal. At home, the Labour government of 1945 built a welfare state, founding the National Health Service and extending Social Security, embodying a promise of fairness born from wartime sacrifice. Abroad, decolonization began. India achieved independence in 1947, followed by wave after wave of colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The empire that had once spanned the globe contracted rapidly, though Britain sought to reshape it into a commonwealth of nations, bound less by rule than by shared history. The 1950s and 1960s brought cultural transformation. While rationing and austerity lingered after the war, prosperity gradually returned. New technologies, motorways, and television reshaped daily life. A younger generation, raised without memory of the Victorian world, forged new identities in music, fashion, and art. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and countless others made Britain the center of a global cultural revolution. As swinging London captured imaginations, yet economic challenges persisted and the loss of empire weighed heavily as Britain sought a new role in a world dominated by superpowers. In politics, Britain turned increasingly toward Europe. After years of hesitation, it joined the European Economic Community in 1973, seeking to anchor its fortunes within a regional bloc. But debates over sovereignty and identity persisted, foreshadowing future divisions. At the same time, domestic upheavals tested the nation. Strikes in the 1970s, economic crises, and the tensions of Northern Ireland, where violence erupted as communities clashed over questions of identity and rule. The 1980s brought a new direction under Margaret Thatcher. Her government embraced privatization, reduced the power of trade unions, and championed free market economics. For supporters, it was a revival of enterprise and national pride. For critics, it deepened inequality and eroded social cohesion. Abroad, Britain fought to defend the Falkland Islands in 1982, a reminder that even in retreat, it could project power when challenged. By the end of the century, Britain had changed profoundly. The empire was gone, replaced by a commonwealth and a more modest role on the global stage. Yet the nation remained influential, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nuclear power, and a leading financial center. London's skyline mixed the grandeur of its past with the modernity of glass towers, while its streets echoed with voices from across the former empire as immigration reshaped the very fabric of British society. The 20th century was not only a story of decline, but of adaptation. Britain had faced the loss of empire, the devastation of war, and the challenges of rebuilding, yet it emerged as a modern democracy with a vibrant culture, a welfare state, and enduring global influence. From the trenches of the First World War to the bombed streets of the Second, from the independence of India to the music of the Beatles, it was a century in which Britain both endured and reinvented itself. As the century closed, the monarchy remained, symbolized by Queen Elizabeth II, who ascended in 1952 and carried the crown into a new era. She embodied continuity amid change, her reign witnessing the retreat of empire, the transformations of society, and the search for Britain's place in the modern world. The 20th century was the story of a nation that had once ruled over a quarter of the earth, finding new ways to define itself after empire, still proud, still searching, still shaping, and being shaped by the world around it. From the upheavals of war and empire in the 20th century, Britain entered the 21st still influential, yet searching for its place in a rapidly changing world. As the 21st century opened, Britain stood at a crossroads. The empire was long gone, yet its legacies remained etched in law, language, and the diverse fabric of its society. The United Kingdom was no longer the workshop of the world, nor the unrivaled naval giant of earlier centuries, but it remained a nation of influence, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a financial hub, a cultural beacon, and a constitutional monarchy that endured into the modern age. The challenge now was to define its identity not through conquest or industry alone, but through adaptation in a rapidly changing world. The early years of the new century were marked by optimism and uncertainty. Britain, under Tony Blair's government, positioned itself as a global actor in the new order after the Cold War, intervening in Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, and Iraq. These wars, justified in the name of security and humanitarian duty, sparked intense debate at home as the nation weighed its responsibilities abroad against the costs and consequences. The role of Britain as America's closest ally was reaffirmed, but it also deepened divisions within society and politics. At the same time, Britain's internal landscape shifted. Devolution in the late 1990s had granted Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland their own assemblies and parliaments, reshaping the balance of the Union forged in 1707. This decentralization gave voice to regional identities, yet it also reopened old questions about unity. The Scottish independence movement grew steadily, culminating in a referendum in 2014. Though Scotland voted to remain, the debate revealed how fragile and contested the United Kingdom had become. Economically, Britain experienced both prosperity and strain. London continued to thrive as a global financial center, its skyline transformed by modern towers and its streets alive with international culture. Immigration reshaped the nation's demography, bringing vitality and diversity, while also fueling debates over integration and identity. The financial crisis of 2008, however, exposed vulnerabilities, leading to austerity policies and deepening inequality. For many, the promises of globalization seemed unevenly shared, and discontent simmered beneath the surface. Nowhere was this more evident than in the 2016 referendum on membership in the European Union. When the vote returned a narrow majority to leave, it sent shockwaves through Britain and the world. Brexit, as it became known, was more than a policy shift. It was a reckoning with identity, sovereignty, and the nation's place in the world. For some, it was the reclaiming of independence. For others, a retreat from cooperation and influence. The years that followed were marked by negotiation, division, and uncertainty, as Britain sought to redefine its role beyond the European continent. Through all these upheavals, the monarchy endured, a constant presence in times of turbulence. Queen Elizabeth II, who had ascended the throne in 1952, became not only the longest-reigning monarch in British history, but also a symbol of continuity across eras of immense change. Her steady presence reassured a nation that often found itself at odds with itself. Through decolonization, Cold War, cultural revolutions, and political crises. In her later years, she became a living link to the sacrifices of the Second World War and the transformations of the 20th century, embodying dignity and service as Britain navigated the challenges of the 21st. Culturally, Britain remained influential far beyond its shores. From literature to music, from cinema to sport, the creativity of its people projected soft power that no decline in empire could erase. The global reach of the English language, the Premier League, and the cultural dynamism of cities like London, Manchester, and Edinburgh kept Britain at the forefront of the world's imagination. Yet the century also forced Britain to confront its past. Debates about empire, slavery, and colonialism grew louder as statues were questioned and histories re-examined. The nation wrestled with how to honor its achievements while acknowledging the suffering intertwined with its rise. This reckoning was not only about the past, but also about how Britain would define itself in the future, a society of inclusivity, memory, and resilience. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away in 2022, the moment marked the end of an era. Her death closed a chapter that had stretched from the ashes of the Second World War to the complexities of Brexit Britain. The crowds that gathered to mourn her reflected not only grief, but also the recognition of her role as a thread of continuity through decades of transformation. The crown passed to Charles III, and with it, new questions emerged about the role and relevance of monarchy in a modern democracy. By the early decades of the 21st century, Britain was no longer the empire that had once ruled a quarter of the globe, nor the industrial powerhouse of the 19th century. It was instead a medium-sized nation with enduring influence, balancing tradition with change and memory with reinvention. Its story was one of survival and adaptation, of a kingdom that had faced conquest, civil war, revolution, and world war, yet endured into the modern day. The journey from Alfred the Great to Elizabeth II, from Viking invasions to Brexit, was not a straight line, but a tapestry of resilience, struggle, and transformation. Britain's history revealed a people who, time and again, redefined themselves in the face of challenge. The island that had once feared annihilation at the hands of invaders had grown into an empire, and from the empire's decline had forged a modern identity, one still unfolding. In the end, the history of England and later Britain was not merely the tale of kings and queens, of wars and treaties, but of a society in constant motion, shaped by ideas, inventions, faith, and conflict. As the 21st century advanced, the legacy of that history remained alive, reminding the world that the story of Britain was never static, but always a dialogue between past and future, continuity and change.